My wife handed me a severance envelope on live television, the way you'd tip a valet you never intend to see again, and told 40 of the world's most important food critics that I was a sweet, talentless little cook she'd carried out of pity for 6 years. The envelope had my name spelled wrong. That's the detail that got me. 6 years of marriage, and she still thought there were 2 N's in Ren. For half a second, the old fury came up my throat like a pot boiling over, and I actually pictured the number of ways a person could ruin a kitchen this size. And it passed, because I remembered something she didn't know. Every dish that made the Marchetti name worth $40 billion I built. Every star on their walls, I earned in the dark and let her staple her face to. So I took the envelope. I smiled the small, polite smile you give a guest who's about to get exactly the meal they ordered. Keep the photo, sweetheart. It'll make excellent evidence. Let me back up 10 minutes because the setup matters more than the slap. The event was the relaunch of Aurelia, the Marchetti flagship, the restaurant that put them on every best in the world list on the planet. 200 guests. A live stream to about 9 million people who care too much about tweezers and foam. Every critic who mattered, plus the ones who only think they matter, seated at long tables under lights hot enough to sear a scallop. And on the stage, under all of it, my wife Celine, in a dress that cost more than the down payment on the house she'd told everyone I couldn't afford. Beside her, Dorian Pike, the Empire's celebrity chef, the face on the cookbooks, the jaw on the magazine covers. He had the confident stance of a man who has never once had to actually cook the thing he's photographed holding. They'd built the whole night to look like a coronation. It was supposed to end with Celine naming Dorian the new executive genius of the Marchetti Group, passing the crown, the devoted wife stepping back from the spotlight, humbly elevating the next great talent. Tears, applause, a hashtag. What they added at the last second was me. "Before we begin," Celine said, and her voice did that soft wobble she'd trademarked. The one that made rooms lean forward. "I have something personal to share. A goodbye." She found me at my table near the kitchen doors where they'd seated me, which should have been my first clue. My husband Ren has been by my side for 6 years, and I love him. I do. She pressed a hand to her chest. 9 million people went, "Aw," but love isn't the same as partnership. Ren is not a chef. He never was. He's the man who washed my knives and believed in me, and I will always be grateful for that. Tonight, I'm setting him free to find a life that fits him better than mine ever could. Then she walked down off the stage, across the whole room, so every camera could track her, and she put that envelope in my hand like she was laying a wreath. I want you to understand what she was actually doing, because it's cleverer than it looks. She wasn't just dumping me, she was building an alibi. If she cut me loose quietly, someone might wonder why the talentless husband was always the last one in the kitchen every night, why the menus changed the week I stopped sleeping. So she made it a performance. Generous, public, impossible to argue with. She made herself the saint and me the charity case in front of the exact people who might otherwise ask questions. After tonight, if I ever stood up and said those dishes were mine, I'd sound like a bitter ex clawing at a woman who'd only ever been kind to me. She's smart. I'll give her that once, since I won't be able to later. I stood up. The room braced for a scene. I could feel 9 million people leaning in for the sound of a grown man cracking. Dorian, up on stage, was already arranging his face into sympathy, the way you'd arrange garnish, no feeling behind it, just placement. I didn't give them a crack. I gave them a nod. "Thank you, Celine," I said, and my voice carried further than hers because I know how to project across a service without shouting. 6 years of running Expedite in that kitchen teaches you that. It's been an education. Then I picked up my coat and I left, calm as a Sunday. And that calm did more damage than any tantrum, because a man who tantrums is exactly what they told the audience I was. A man who thanks you and walks out is a man who knows something. Celine watched me go with the smallest flicker of confusion, there and gone, like a pilot light struggling in a draft. She'd expected begging. I'd read that plan off her weeks ago. She has never once in 6 years understood what she married. So let me tell you what she married. There's a story the Marchetti family tells about themselves, the one in the documentaries, that the empire was dying 12 years ago, drowning in debt, one bad season from being sold for parts, and that a young Celine Marchetti walked into the kitchen and, through raw genius, invented a menu so extraordinary it clawed the whole dynasty back from the grave. 3 stars. A comeback for the ages. They screen it at the culinary schools now. Here's the version without the makeup. 12 years ago, I was a broke line cook with a knife roll and a palate that scared people. And Celine Marchetti found me plating for a caterer at one of her mother's parties. Not because she saw a soulmate, because she saw a resource. Her mother, Livia, the actual mind behind that family, needed a genius and couldn't manufacture one from her own bloodline. So they went shopping. They married me to keep the genius in-house and unpaid. And for 6 of those 12 years, I have cooked every dish that saved them in a back kitchen. at night, and handed it up the line for Celine to carry to the pass and take the bow. The signature course that won them the 3rd star? Mine. I dreamed it during a fever and wrote it on the back of a delivery invoice. Celine named it after her grandmother. You'd think, being that useful, I'd have lived well. I slept in the staff quarters above the commissary, on a cot, because Celine said my restlessness disturbed her. My salary was a monthly allowance she called generous, and I called a leash. When she wanted to buy a watch for Dorian, or a weekend for the investor she was also entertaining, or press coverage from the media man who kept her on the covers, she put it on the card that drew from my account, because it amused her that the man she called worthless was paying for the men she called exciting. She thought I didn't know about all 3 of them. I knew about all 3 of them the way I know when a stock's about to break, by smell, before the thermometer confirms it. Now here's the part nobody in that room understood, and I need you to hold it because everything that comes after runs on it. I never spent the money. For 6 years I cooked genius for free and lived like a monk on a leash, and every dollar I could quietly move, I moved. Not into watches, into the one thing worth owning. When the Marchetti Group took on debt to fund their expansion, and they took on a mountain of it, because Livia loves the look of growth more than the fact of it. That debt got sold and traded and repackaged the way debt does, and a very patient, very anonymous holding vehicle registered 3 countries away kept buying it. Kept buying the equity, too, in slivers, through shells that never once had my name near them. 6 years of that. Slice after slice. The Marchetti family does not own the Marchetti empire. I do. Controlling interest. Legally, cleanly, quietly. They just haven't been told yet. And even that isn't the whole knife. In the food world, there's a title people whisper about the way sailors used to whisper about a lighthouse in fog. The phantom palate. The anonymous master judge whose single blind verdict, once a year, crowns the World Gastronomy Championship. The one competition that can make a restaurant group untouchable or end it in an afternoon. Nobody knows who the phantom is. Committees have offered fortunes to find out. Critics have built careers guessing. The phantom has never been seen, never been named, never been wrong. The phantom palate is me has been for 5 years. I judged the finals that made 2 of the Marchetti Group's biggest rivals, and I judged the one that quietly kept a small, honest kitchen alive. And Celine poured me cheap wine at home the night after each of them, and asked why I always looked tired in the spring. So when my wife stood on a stage and told 9 million people I was a sweet little cook who washed her knives, she was technically 1 for 3. I have washed knives. I also own the building the knives are in, wrote the recipes the knives cut for, and hold the one verdict her entire empire is, at this exact moment, about to need to survive. She just doesn't know it's about to need anything. She thinks tonight was her victory lap. It was a starting gun. She fired it at herself. I got as far as the alley behind the commissary before someone caught me, and it was the only person in that whole gleaming empire I'd have stopped for. Bruno, 71, hands like tree roots, official title dishwasher, actual history a Michelin-starred chef in Turin before a fire and a bad partner took it all and dropped him at the bottom of someone else's sink. Bruno taught me the difference between cooking that's clever and cooking that's true. On smoke breaks, in a language of grunts and tastes off a spoon. Everyone else in that kitchen looked through me because Celine told them to. Bruno looked at me like I was worth feeding. He was holding a thermos. Of course he was. Broth, he said. You didn't eat. You never eat when you're winning. I'm not winning, Bruno. I got publicly divorced on a live stream. He pushed the thermos into my chest. Boy, I've watched you plate for 6 years. You only get that quiet, dead flat face when you've already decided how something ends. He studied me. So how does it end? I drank the broth. It was obviously perfect. The man could make consommé out of grief. And I thought about the stage, and the envelope with the extra N, and Dorian's placed garnish face, and Celine's little flicker of confusion, and Livia somewhere backstage counting a victory she hadn't actually won. Slowly, I said, and in public. And they're going to help me do it without knowing they're helping. Bruno grinned, showing the gold tooth he was inordinately proud of. Good, he said. I kept something for you. Been keeping it a while. He reached into his coat and pulled out a shoebox, taped shut, soft at the corners from age. Her notebooks, all 6 years. The ones she thinks she threw out. I fished them out of the bin the first week, and I never stopped fishing. Every recipe, every date. Every time she signed her name on your work. I wrote down what day, what dish, who watched. Pressed the box into my free hand over the thermos, so I was holding warmth and evidence at the same time, which felt about right. An old man does the dishes long enough. He sees everything and everyone forgets he's there. I stood in that alley holding 6 years of proof I didn't even know existed, and for the first time all night something in my chest actually moved. Bruno, I said, You have no idea what you just handed me. I have some idea, he said. I handed you the receipts. Now go be terrible to the right people. He paused. And come back and cook for me sometime. Nobody left in that place who can make a stock worth drinking. Pike boils it like he's mad at the water. I laughed, which surprised me, and headed for the street. And I would have gone straight home to start planning if a car hadn't been waiting for me at the mouth of the alley. Long, black, quiet as a held breath. The kind of car that doesn't belong behind a commissary next to the grease bins. The back window slid down. The woman inside was maybe 35 and looked at me like a butcher looks at a carcass she already knows the yield on. I knew her face the way everyone in food knows her face. Nadia Kestrel, chairwoman of the World Gastronomy Council. Heir to the Kestrel gastronomy dynasty, which is old money the way a cathedral is old, the kind that makes Marchetti 40 billion look like a nice weekend. In our world, she is the single most dangerous human being alive because she is the one person who can convene the championship, seat the judges, and decide whose kitchen gets a future. People rehearse for weeks before speaking to her. Grown chefs have wept in her waiting room. She looked at me eating broth out of a thermos in an alley in a coat I'd owned for 9 years. Ren Vale, she said. Not a question. She'd spelled it right in her head. I could hear it. I watched your very public evening. Then you saw a sweet, talentless little cook get set free, I said. Congratulations, you're witnessing a rescue. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. A smile's colder cousin. I've been looking for someone for 5 years, Mr. Vale, she said. A ghost. A palate that judges like it invented taste and then went home and told no one. I've offered obscene amounts of money for a name. I've never gotten close. Her eyes did something then, went from butcher to something worse, something patient. And tonight I watched a woman who couldn't season a broth if you handed her the salt stand on a stage and take credit for a menu I have personally tasted and known. In my bones, was made by someone she is nowhere near talented enough to be. The alley got very quiet. Even Bruno, behind me, stopped breathing. So here's my evening, Nadia went on, unhurried, a woman who has never once been rushed by anything in her life. I came to a relaunch to see who Marchetti crowns because Marchetti is about to need this year's championship very badly, for reasons they think are secret and aren't. And instead of a crown, I watched them throw away the only interesting thing they've ever had. She let that land. I don't know yet if you're my ghost, Mr. Vale, but I know you're not what she said you are. Nobody walks out of a humiliation like that with your face unless the humiliation was aimed at the wrong man. New fear unlocked. Do not react. Do not react. I have a council to run and a championship to seat, she said. And Marchetti is going to spend the next months begging me for a verdict they don't understand they can't buy. I find that entertaining. I'd find it more entertaining with you in the room. She held out a card. Heavy stock. 1 number, no name. Come see me. We'll talk about what taste is worth. And Mr. Vale, bring the notebooks. The old man's not as subtle as he thinks. The window slid up before I could decide whether to be terrified or impressed. The car pulled away like the alley had bored it. I stood there holding a thermos, a shoebox of receipts, and a card from the most powerful person in my entire world. Having lost a wife I never had and gained the exact 3 tools I needed to bury the people who thought they'd buried me. Bruno let out a low whistle. Boy, he said. What did you do to get that one looking at you? Nothing, I said, honestly. Yet. The next morning, the internet had a new favorite widow. Celine had posted a photo of herself at dawn. Mascara artfully smudged, captioned about the pain of loving someone who couldn't grow with you. 4 million likes. Comments calling her brave. Somewhere in there, Dorian had quote posted it with a single white heart. The least effort a human can perform, and the food press was already running with the story of the graceful chef queen who freed her poor husband. The narrative was set in aspic before I'd finished my coffee. Good. Let it set. Aspic's easier to shatter than you'd think. I didn't call a lawyer, I didn't call a reporter, I didn't post a rebuttal. Because rebuttals are for people who don't have the receipts, and I now had a shoebox of them. Instead, I did the one thing that would hurt the most while looking like nothing at all. I let Dorian talk, because here's the thing about installing a fraud as your genius. You then have to make him behave like one, in front of people whose whole job is noticing when he can't. And Dorian Pike, 3 days after my exit, walked into a press lunch, sat under the lights he was built for, and started describing his flagship dish, the one that was about to headline Aurelia's new menu, the one Celine had named after her grandmother. The one I wrote on the back of a delivery invoice during a 103-degree fever 6 years ago. He got the plating right. He'd seen the photos. He got the story right. He'd been coached. Then a young critic, sharp, hungry, the kind who hasn't been bought yet, asked him a simple question. Just one, about the technique at the core of the dish. The thing that makes it work. The bit you can only know if your hands built it, because it isn't written down anywhere. It lives in the difference between a sauce that breaks and a sauce that holds, and it's counterintuitive, and it's mine, and I never taught it to anyone but Bruno. Dorian answered confidently, fluently, beautifully, and completely catastrophically wrong. He described a method that would, if you actually did it, split the sauce into oil and sorrow within 90 seconds. He said it like scripture. He smiled at the end, pleased with his own genius, a man admiring a house he built on a swamp. The young critic wrote it down, and the young critic, who had eaten the real dish once and never forgotten it, knew. You could see the exact moment the knowledge crossed her face. Not shock, worse. A slow professional cooling. The look of someone realizing the emperor's been describing his own clothes to her and getting the fabric wrong. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I had one anonymous account, 5 years of credibility as a ghost nobody could trace, and a single quiet message to that same young critic. Ask him to cook it live, just once. On camera. Watch what the sauce does. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The phantom palette doesn't sign things. By that evening, Dorian's answer was a clip. By midnight, the clip had a caption I hadn't written but couldn't have written better. Does the Marchetti genius know how his own signature works? The food world is a small, violent village, and it smells blood before it sees it. Celine called me at 1 a.m. first time in 3 days. First time, honestly, in longer than that. What did you do? She said. No hello, her voice had lost the wobble. Underneath the saint, there's always been a much older, much colder animal, and it was awake now. I got set free, I said. Remember? You were there. 9 million people were there. Dorian's fine. It's a nothing clip. But if you think you're going to, Celine, I said, gently, the way you'd talk to a guest who's about to complain that the dish is exactly what they ordered. I haven't done anything. Your genius answered a question about his own cooking. That's between him and the sauce. I let a beat pass. How is the sauce, by the way? Holding, silence on the line. In that silence, I could hear the whole machinery of her starting, for the first time, to grind against a thing it couldn't move. You're going to want to be very careful, she said finally. I'm always careful, I said. It's how I lived on a cot in your commissary for 6 years without anyone noticing I was awake. And I hung up, because you never let them get the last word. You make them lie in bed listening to the dial tone and doing math. I set the phone down. Bruno's shoebox sat on my kitchen table, taped, patient, 6 years deep. Nadia's card sat beside it. One number, no name. Somewhere across the city, an empire that legally belonged to me was congratulating itself on getting rid of its own foundation, and a woman I'd never really met was waiting to find out if I was her ghost. I'd told Bruno it would be slow and public, and that they'd help me do it without knowing. I hadn't told him the best part. The part I was only just letting myself feel, alone in that kitchen, at 1 in the morning with a dial tone dying in my hand. I wasn't going to fight them for the empire. The empire was already mine. I was just going to let them keep polishing it until the day I walked in and turned on the lights. Nadia Kestrel's office was on the top floor of a building that didn't have the Kestrel name on it anywhere, because when you're that old and that rich, you don't advertise. The people who need you already know the address. No assistant, no waiting room theater. Just her. A long table of raw ingredients laid out like a crime scene, and a single knife she was using to break down a fish with the bored precision of someone who could do it blind. You brought the notebooks, she said, without looking up. I brought myself, I said. The notebooks stay where the old man hid them. That got her attention. She set the knife down, wiped her hands, and looked at me the way you look at a dish that's more interesting than you expected. Smart. If you'd handed them over on the first meeting, you'd be a man selling his only leverage to a stranger for a nod. You kept them. She almost approved. Sit, eat. You still haven't eaten, I can tell. Your face does a thing. My face doesn't do a thing. Your face does the thing chefs do when they've been running on adrenaline and spite for 3 days and no protein. She slid a plate across the table. Crudo, fish, she'd just broken down. A few drops of something bright, nothing else. It was, of course, excellent. Restrained in the way only genuinely powerful people can afford to be. She watched me taste it, and I watched her watch me. And neither of us said the obvious thing, which was that we were both reading the other for the same secret. Here's what I know, she said, sitting. The Marchetti Group is one bad quarter from being a headline. Livia overexpanded, the way vain people always do, and the debt on that empire is a house of cards in a wind tunnel. There is exactly one thing that can save them. Winning this year's World Gastronomy Championship. A sovereign wealth fund has quietly promised an obscene investment, but only into the winning group. Only into a name the championship crowns. Livia knows this. It's why the relaunch, why the Dorian coronation, why the whole circus she's building a story worth investing in, and she needs the trophy to close it. Nadia leaned back. And the championship has one final judge, the phantom palette, a ghost nobody has ever found, whose verdict can't be bought, which drives Livia insane, because Livia can buy anything. A pause, precise as a knife cut. So, Livia's entire survival now depends on a verdict from a person she cannot identify, cannot bribe, and cannot control. I find that the funniest thing that has happened in my industry in a decade. It's pretty funny, I agreed, giving nothing. It would be funnier, Nadia said, if that ghost happened to be the man Livia's daughter just threw into an alley on live television. She let the sentence sit there, warm and terrible. But of course I have no way of knowing that. The phantom is anonymous. That's the whole point. I'm merely noting a delicious hypothetical. Internal alarm. Do not confirm. Do not deny. Give her a dish, not an answer. Here's my hypothetical, I said. A woman who runs the most powerful body in food doesn't drive to an alley behind a commissary for a hypothetical. What do you actually want, Miss Kestrel? She smiled then, the full one, and I understood why grown chefs wept in her waiting room, because a smile from Nadia Kestrel is warmer than the sun and roughly as safe to stand near. I want a show, she said simply. The championship is a coronation for the same 3 tired empires every year. It's boring. My family has run this thing for 4 generations, and I have watched it become a trade show for the rich. I want blood on the floor. I want a David who can actually cook walking into Livia's Goliath and gutting it in front of the whole world. Cleanly, legally, and with excellent knife work. She spread her hands, and I happened to have, sitting in a failing 12-seat room across town, a chef the Marchettis blackballed 6 years ago for the crime of being better than their daughter. Her name is Priya Anand. She's brilliant and broke and furious, and she has a kitchen and no genius to lead it. Nadia looked at me. You need a face to fight from that, isn't bitter ex-husband. You need a kitchen, a crew, a legitimate entry. She needs you. I need a show. Take the job. Lead Cinder into the qualifiers. Beat Marchetti in the open, on the plate, where nobody can call it a lie. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to finish the crudo, which is to say not long, because it was a small plate, and she was right about the protein. And the phantom judges the final, I said carefully. So if this David of yours makes it that far, the anonymous ghost judging her against the people who ruined her is a conflict of interest so enormous it would end the championship if it ever came out. Nadia finished pleasantly. Yes. Isn't it wonderful? I do hope the ghost recuses himself at the appropriate moment, in the most public way imaginable. She stood, our meeting apparently over on her schedule alone. Cinder, tomorrow morning, Priya's expecting you. At the door, she added. Not turning around, the fish was line caught this morning off a boat I own. I broke it down myself. I wanted to see if you'd noticed the cut was 2 hours old and the flavor was still that clean. A beat. You noticed. It's in your face again. Good night, Mr. Vale. I left her office knowing 3 things. She was almost certain I was the phantom. She was going to use me to burn Livia Marchetti to the ground for reasons of her own that had nothing to do with me. And she'd made me a fish just to watch me eat it, which no one had done in 6 years, and I was in more trouble than any envelope could measure. Across town, in the empire that legally belonged to me, things were going exactly as badly as I'd planned by doing nothing at all. Here's the problem with building your fraud out of a man who's never cooked. Eventually dinner service happens. Aurelia had reopened to the public with the new menu. My menu, the one they'd relaunched under Dorian's name. And for 4 nights it had been fine, because a good brigade can carry a menu that already exists, as long as nobody changes anything. But Dorian couldn't leave it alone. A genius has to look like he's creating, so he improved the signature course. He adjusted the technique, the one he'd described so confidently and so wrongly to that critic, and told the brigade to plate it his way. The sauce broke. Of course it broke. It broke exactly the way I told the young critic it would. Oil weeping away from solids like the dish itself was disappointed in him, and it broke on the plates of 40 guests who had paid $400 to eat the most photographed dish in the country. 2 of them filmed it. One of them was a food influencer with a following the size of a small nation. By the next morning, Aurelia had a new nickname, and it wasn't the flattering kind. The Broken Star. The clips of Dorian's confident wrong interview and the weeping sauce got cut together by strangers on the internet who do this sort of thing for love. Reservations, which had been booked 8 months out, developed a sudden and unusual number of cancellations. I want to be clear that I did none of this. I didn't have to. I'd simply stopped standing in the dark holding the sauce together, and it turned out the sauce had been the only one working late. Celine handled it the way she handles everything, with a press statement, a soft focus photo, and a lie. A single off night at a restaurant of Aurelia's caliber is not news, her people said. We stand fully behind Chef Pike's vision. Behind the scenes, I later learned from Bruno, who still did the dishes and therefore still heard everything. It was less serene. Dorian had thrown a pan, Celine had thrown a review, And Livia hadn't thrown anything, which was worse, because Livia only goes quiet when she's about to do math. The math she did produced a memo. And the memo, 3 days later, produced the single stupidest thing that family ever committed to paper, which is saying a great deal. They announced Aurelia would defend its honor at the regional qualifier showcase. Live, televised. Dorian Pike cooking the signature dish in the open to prove the malicious clips were lies. They baited themselves onto the hook I'd been too patient to even bother baiting. Because by then, I'd taken the job. Cinder was everything Nadia had promised. 12 seats, a kitchen the size of a good closet, a walk-in that wheezed, and a chef named Priya Anand who met me at the door with her arms crossed and a look that could strip paint. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, before I was fully through the door. "I don't need a celebrity charity case. I don't need Livia Marchetti's leftovers. And I definitely don't need the pity husband from the internet coming to save the poor blackballed girl." She jabbed a finger at me. "I've read every review of Aurelia's menu for 6 years, and I can taste the person who wrote it, and it isn't Celine Marchetti. And it isn't that mannequin Pike. So you tell me right now, before you touch a single one of my pans. Was it you?" I looked at her kitchen. Tiny. Honest. Every surface scrubbed by someone who couldn't afford to replace anything. A brigade of 3, all young, all looking at me like I might be the last hope or the final insult. I picked up a spoon off her pass, tasted the sauce she had working. A good sauce, a smart sauce, a sauce built by someone with real hands and no money. And I fixed it in one motion, a pinch of acid, a whisper of fat. The counterintuitive thing that only lives in the hands. Priya went still. Then she tasted it. Then her eyes got bright and furious and hopeful all at once. "It was me," I said. "All of it, 6 years. And they threw me in an alley for it. So here's my offer, Chef Anand. I don't want to save you. I want to hand you the knife I've been sharpening for 6 years, and I want to watch you put it exactly where it belongs. Let's go win a championship the people who ruined us both are about to bet their whole empire on. And let's start by ruining their little showcase." Priya wiped her eyes with the back of a wrist, furious at herself for the tears, and stuck out her hand. "Bruno told me you'd be dramatic," she said. "He's coming too, by the way. Says he's not spending his last good years watching Pike boil stock like he's punishing it." That was the crew. A blackballed genius, a fired legend on the dish pit, 3 kids nobody had bet on, and me. 12 seats against $40 billion. I liked our odds. I liked them a great deal. The industry did not agree, and that was the point. When the news broke that Cinder, a 12-seat nobody, had entered the regional qualifier, and that its new consulting chef was Ren Vale, estranged husband of Celine Marchetti, the response was a laugh you could hear from space. The food press had a field day. "Pity cook opens toy kitchen to spite ex-wife" was one of the kinder headlines. Celine's camp didn't even bother to attack. They mocked, which is worse and which I encouraged, because a person who is mocking you is a person who has stopped watching your hands. Dorian posted a photo of himself at Aurelia's gleaming pass with a caption about "real kitchens, real stars." Livia said nothing, publicly. Privately, she sent one of her people to eat at Cinder to assess the threat, because Livia never leaves a laugh unverified. Her spy sat at seat 4, ordered the tasting. And somewhere around the 4th course, a dish Priya and I had built together, her fire and my counterintuition, a plate that tasted like an argument you lose gratefully. The spy stopped taking notes and just ate, the way people do when the food has stopped being research and started being an experience. He paid. He left an enormous tip, which spies aren't supposed to do. And the report he took back to Livia was, Bruno told me later with enormous satisfaction, 1 sentence long. "They're going to embarrass us." Livia read it. And for the first time, the woman who does math when she's afraid did the math and didn't like the answer. But it was too late to pull out of the showcase without admitting the clips were true. She'd committed Dorian to cooking my dish, live on television, to prove he was the genius, so we let him. The regional qualifier showcase was held in a converted market hall, under lights that could have grown tomatoes, in front of 200 industry people and a live broadcast that pulled numbers because the internet loves a train it's been told is going to crash. 2 stations. Aurelia on one side, gleaming and sponsored and enormous, Dorian at the center in a jacket with his name stitched in gold. Cinder on the other, 4 of us, and a wheezing induction burner we'd borrowed. Priya at the center where she belonged, and me at her shoulder where I belonged. And in the front row, in the seat reserved for the chair of the World Gastronomy Council, Nadia Kestrel, who had personally decided to attend a regional qualifier for the first time in her career, which everyone noticed and nobody understood. The rules were simple. Each station would cook 1 dish for a panel of 5 critics, blind, no names on the plates, judged on the food alone. And Dorian, to prove his point, had announced in advance that he would cook the signature, My signature. The broken sauce dish that had made him a meme. I could have stopped him. I could have leaked the real technique, or spared him, or done any of a dozen merciful things. I did none of them, because mercy is a thing you extend to people who wouldn't have thrown you in an alley. And I'd run out of it around the time Celine misspelled my name. Dorian cooked. He was good on camera. I'll give the mannequin that. He moved beautifully. He played it like a photograph. And when it came to the sauce, the counterintuitive heart of the whole dish, he did exactly what he'd done at Aurelia. Exactly what he'd described to the young critic. Exactly the confident wrong thing. And the sauce broke. On camera, in front of 200 people and a live broadcast, the emulsion split and wept and slid, oil pooling away from solids like the dish was trying to physically leave the country. Dorian didn't even notice at first. He was smiling at a camera. Then a runner brought the plated course toward the pass, and he saw it, and the smile stayed on his face a beat too long. The way a photo of a smile does after the person behind it has already died inside. His face went the specific dull gray of a scallop that's been sitting out too long. That faintly translucent, no longer fresh color. And I want you to know I have waited 6 years to describe someone that way, and it was worth it. Priya, meanwhile, cooked my dish. The real one. She built the sauce the true way, the counterintuitive way. Her hands and my method, and it held like it was carved out of marble and glowed. She plated it clean. And when the blind panel tasted both plates, one weeping, one perfect, neither labeled, 5 critics who did not know which station was which awarded the top marks, unanimously, to the plate from the 12-seat toy kitchen that the whole internet had come to watch fail. The hall was silent for exactly 1 second. Then it detonated. But the real moment, the one that mattered, came after, when the marks were confirmed and Dorian was standing at his gleaming sponsored station with a broken sauce and a dead smile, and Nadia Kestrel rose from the front row. She never rises. She rose, and she walked, unhurried, across the whole hall, past Aurelia's $40 billion to the wheezing borrowed burner at Cinder, and she picked up the perfect plate, and she tasted it in front of everyone, and she closed her eyes. "There it is," she said, not loud. But the hall had gone so quiet you could hear a spoon drop 3 counties over, so everyone heard. I've been eating this kitchen's food for years and never once at its source. She opened her eyes and looked directly at me, and then at the cameras, and then at the section of the front row where I'd noticed Celine had come to watch her Dorian be vindicated. The World Gastronomy Council, Nadia said, will be watching Cinder very closely this season. Whoever's cooking here, a small devastating pause, is the real thing. And the real thing is rare enough that I'll cross a room for it. I don't cross rooms. Then she set the plate down, nodded to Priya like an equal, gave me a look that was not remotely professional and walked out, leaving $40 billion of broken sauce behind her. I have witnessed a lot of power moves in my life. I have never seen a room reorganized around one woman's palate that fast. Every critic who'd laughed at the pity cook was now furiously rewriting their season predictions. Every camera that had come to film a train wreck had filmed the wrong train. And Celine Marchetti, in the front row, was staring at the plate Nadia Kestrel had crossed a room for, the plate with my food on it, with an expression I hadn't seen on her in 6 years of marriage. She was looking at me like she was seeing me, for the first time, genuinely trying to do the math on what she'd thrown into an alley. She caught me the moment I stepped outside for air, because of course she did. She'd trained her whole life to catch people at their most exposed. But she'd never once caught me exposed, and she made the mistake of thinking tonight was the night. Ren, softer than the phone call, the wobble back in place. She'd changed tactics somewhere between the broken sauce and the door. And now she was doing the version of Celine that had, 12 years ago, convinced a broke-line cook that a Marchetti could love him. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know how good you'd gotten. Come home, we'll fix all of this. You and me, the way it was supposed to be. The way it was supposed to be, I repeated. You mean the cot in the commissary? The card you spent on Dorian's watch? The name you couldn't spell on the envelope? I wasn't angry. That was the part she couldn't process. There was no anger for her to work with. Nothing to soften or seduce. Just a man reading her an accurate menu. There was never a you and me, Celine. There was a genius in your basement and a lie in your spotlight. I've moved out of the basement. That's all that's changed. Her face did something complicated then, several expensive emotions competing for the lead. She reached for the last weapon she had, the oldest one. Dorian was a mistake, she said. And the investor, and I know you knew, I know you always knew, and you never said anything because you loved me too much to. I never said anything, I said, because a chef doesn't argue with a spoiled ingredient. He just stops using it. I stepped past her toward the car, then stopped, because I am not, whatever the internet says, entirely without cruelty. And there was one more thing worth saying. Your empire's going to need this championship, Celine, Badly. Everyone in that hall just watched who's actually going to win it. I let her hold that. Sleep well, do the math. I got in the car. Nadia was in the back seat, because of course she was, because she orchestrates exits the way she breaks down fish. That was petty, she observed, as we pulled away from a Celine standing very still on the curb. Deeply, I agreed. I enjoyed it enormously. She handed me a container. Broth. Warm. You didn't eat. Your face was doing the thing. She looked out the window at the receding lights of the market hall where her palette had just rearranged an entire industry on my behalf, and said, almost to herself, "We're going to burn that whole empire down to the studs, Mr. Vale. And then, I think I'm going to make you cook me dinner in the ashes." A pause. You may say no. I'll simply keep asking until the answer bores you into yes. It usually does. I ate the broth. It was perfect. Behind us, in a market hall full of broken sauce, Livia Marchetti was already doing the math on the one variable she couldn't solve. A ghost she couldn't name. A championship she had to win. And a son-in-law she'd thrown away who kept showing up on the winning side of every plate. She didn't know yet that all three were the same problem. She only knew for the first time in her long, careful life that she was losing to someone she couldn't see. She'd find out who I was eventually. I was rather looking forward to picking the moment. Livia Marchetti did her math for exactly 1 week, and then she stopped being quiet. And I'll be honest with you, the counterattack was good. It was the kind of good that reminds you the woman built an empire out of nothing but debt and nerve, and that underestimating her would be its own kind of broken sauce. She didn't come at Cinder's food. She'd tasted the spy's report. She knew the food was real, and you can't argue with a plate 5 blind critics scored. So she came at the story instead. Because Livia understood something most people miss. The public doesn't eat the food, they eat the narrative, and the narrative was up for grabs. Her weapon was a man named Caspian Rogue. If you don't know the name, know the shape of him. Rogue owned half the food media that mattered, the magazines, the awards ballots, the influencer networks, the whole apparatus that decides which chef is a genius and which is a fraud, independent of whether either is true. He also happened to be the second of Celine's 3 quiet arrangements. The media man who kept her on covers. Olivia framed it to herself as a business relationship because Livia frames everything to herself as whatever she can live with. Rogue had spent Celine's affection and Marchetti's ad budget in equal measure for years. Now Livia called in the favor. The story broke on a Tuesday. Across every outlet, Rogue touched at once, which is how you can always tell a manufactured story. Real news trickles. Bought news floods. And the story was this: that Ren Vale, the estranged husband, was not the wronged genius the internet had decided to root for. That he was in fact a thief. That the recipes he was claiming had been developed by the Marchetti test kitchen over years, by a team, and that Ren, a mere line cook who'd married in, had stolen a notebook of proprietary techniques on his way out the door and was now passing a corporation's intellectual property off as his own private brilliance. There were quotes from former colleagues. There was a photo of me at the pass looking through the magic of a cropped angle and an unkind caption, exactly like a man skulking away with something that wasn't his. There was a legal threat, heavily implied. And there was the killer line, the one Rogue's people crafted to turn the whole internet's sympathy inside out. The real victims here are the anonymous Marchetti kitchen team, whose life's work a bitter man is stealing for revenge. It was, as smears go, beautifully built. It took the exact truth that I'd walked out with a notebook of the recipes I invented, and inverted it so cleanly that fighting it would sound like a thief protesting too much. By Tuesday afternoon, a meaningful chunk of the internet had decided they'd been fooled, that the pity cook was actually a con man, and the same crowd that had cheered Nadia crossing a room for my plate was now composing very confident posts about how they'd always found something off about him. Priya found me in Cinder's tiny office, reading the coverage on my phone, and she was vibrating with fury. "Tell me we're suing. Tell me we're going scorched earth. Tell me we're doing nothing," I said. "Yet, nothing? Ren? They're calling you a thief. They're calling me a front for a thief. That's my kitchen's name in that garbage, I know." I set the phone down. "And it's a very good lie. Do you know how you kill a very good lie, Priya?" She didn't answer, because she was too angry to play along, so I did. "You don't argue with it. You wait until the exact moment it's most believed, when everyone's fully committed to it, when the people who spread it have staked their credibility on it being true. And then you show them one piece of paper that turns the whole thing to ash while they're standing on it." I let that settle. Rogue just built a very tall, very public bonfire and stood on top of it to be seen. I'm going to enjoy lighting it, because here's what Rogue didn't know, what Livia didn't know, what none of them could have known. The notebooks weren't the ammunition. The notebooks were bait. The real ammunition was in Bruno's shoebox, the 6 years of dated, witnessed proof, not just the recipes, but the record. Every date I wrote a dish, every date Celine presented it days later. Menu revision logs in my handwriting that predated the official Marchetti versions by weeks. Photographs Bruno had quietly taken a dishwasher with a phone as invisible of me at the pass at 3 a.m., building the courses the family took credit for at 8 p.m. And because Bruno was more thorough than anyone gave a dishwasher the right to be. A running log of who came and went from the back kitchen, which turned out to matter more than any of us first realized. I didn't release it. Not yet. I released one thing. One page. One photograph, time-stamped, of a handwritten recipe, the signature course, the broken sauce dish, on the back of a delivery invoice, dated 6 years and 2 months ago. And underneath it, the official Marchetti recipe card for the same dish, dated 5 years and 11 months ago. 3 months later than mine. In Celine's handwriting, copying mine, with one ingredient changed and one technique she'd misunderstood. The exact misunderstanding that would, years later, make Dorian's sauce break on live television. I posted it from the anonymous account. No commentary. Just the 2 documents side by side and a single line. Ask which one came first. The internet, which loves nothing more than being handed a mystery it can solve itself, solved it in about 90 minutes. The delivery invoice was traceable. The vendor confirmed the date. The handwriting analysis started as a hobby and became a movement, and Rogue's beautiful bonfire, which everyone was standing on, went up all at once, because the crowd that had confidently declared me a thief now had to confront a timestamp. And there is nothing the internet hates more than having been made to look gullible by someone it was told to trust. The story didn't just die, it turned. Marchetti recipe card dated after husband's original, who really stole from whom. Rogue's outlets, which had flooded the smear, went conspicuously silent, which everyone noticed, which made it worse. And the anonymous Marchetti kitchen team that Rogue had positioned as the real victims? The internet went looking for them, and couldn't find a single one, because they'd never existed. The anonymous kitchen team had always been one man on a cot. Caspian Rogue lost something concrete that day, and it wasn't just a news cycle. When you own the machine that decides who's a genius and who's a fraud, your entire value is that people believe the machine is honest. The moment everyone watched Rogue's machine run a bought lie and get caught by a delivery invoice, the machine stopped being worth what he'd built it to be worth. Advertisers get nervous around a compromised outlet. Awards bodies get nervous around a compromised ballot. Rogue had spent his credibility on Livia's favor, and credibility, once spent, doesn't come back with a wire transfer. He called Celine that night, apparently, and it did not go well for her, because a media mogul who's just been publicly gutted on your family's behalf stops being a devoted arrangement and starts being a very angry man who knows exactly which magazine covers you didn't earn. Bruno, doing dishes, heard the end of it. Celine's voice pitched high and thin. Rogue's cold, and the sound of the first crack appearing in the little web she'd spent years spinning. One lover down. He didn't fall to me directly. He fell because Livia used him as a weapon, and I turned the weapon. And now he was a man with a grudge against the family that had spent and discarded him, wandering loose in exactly the season they could least afford loose ends. I sent Nadia the coverage. She sent back one line. You waited a full week to release one page. I've never been more attracted to patience in my life. Come to dinner. Bring the patience. New fear unlocked. Do not read into that. Read entirely into that. The second arrangement to come apart was Marcus Thorne, and Thorne came apart differently, because Thorne was money. And money doesn't get angry, money gets nervous. Marcus Thorne was a hospitality investor, the kind who owns pieces of things rather than things, and he'd owned a piece of Celine for a couple of years in the way that men like Thorne collect proximity to power. More importantly, he was one of the anchor investors backing the Marchetti Group's expansion. Real money, tied to the debt, tied to the whole house of cards Livia had built. And Marcus Thorne read the same delivery invoice everyone else did, and Marcus Thorne, unlike the internet, could read a balance sheet. And what the balance sheet told him was that the genius his money was betting on had a timestamp problem and a broken sauce problem and a crossing the room Nadia Kestrel problem, all in the same month. Money that gets nervous starts asking questions. And Thorne started asking the one question Livia had spent 6 years making sure no one asked. Who actually owns what here? Which is where I finally got to enjoy the part I'd been saving. Because when Marcus Thorne's people started quietly pulling on the ownership thread, trying to understand the debt structure, the equity, who held the paper, they kept hitting a wall. A patient, anonymous holding vehicle, 3 countries away, that had been buying Marchetti debt and equity for 6 years. Thorne's people couldn't crack it. Nobody could crack it. I'd built it not to be cracked. But Thorne could see its shape, and its shape terrified him. because the shape said that somebody invisible, somebody who'd been accumulating in the dark the entire time was sitting on a controlling position in the empire he'd invested in, and that somebody was not Livia Marchetti. I didn't reveal myself. It wasn't time. But I let Thorne's fear do the work, and I helped it along with one small move. Through the vehicle, I let a single tranche of the debt come due, called it in clean and legal and on schedule. A routine thing that any real creditor might do. And I watched the tremor go through the whole structure. Marchetti had to scramble to cover it. It was a small amount, relatively. But it announced, to anyone reading carefully, that the invisible creditor was awake, and paying attention, and not inclined to be patient with a family that was suddenly a very bad bet. Thorne pulled back. Not out would have been noticed, but back. He stopped returning Celine's calls first, which stung her personally. And then he quietly signaled his hesitance to the other anchor investors, which stung the family fatally. Because money is a herd animal, and one nervous investor makes the whole herd lift its head. The sovereign fund, watching from a distance, the one whose enormous investment was promised only to the championship winner, took note that Marchetti's existing backers were getting cold feet. Livia's whole survival plan depended on the fund staying warm. 2 arrangements down, and I hadn't touched either of them with anything but a delivery invoice and a single called loan. The web Celine had spun to hold up her fake life was coming apart along the exact strands she'd used to build it. The media man turned into a grudge. The money man turned into a flight risk. That left one strand. The one she'd never dressed up as business. The one she actually wanted, Dorian. And Dorian, it turned out, had an assistant. Her name was Mila, and she'd worked for Dorian Pike for 2 years, which is a long time to spend close enough to a fraud to smell it. She was the one who actually organized his cookbooks, wrote his captions, coached him through interviews he didn't understand, and, on more than one occasion, quietly fixed his food before it reached a camera so that Chef Pike's vision wouldn't be exposed as a man who genuinely could not cook. Mila had spent 2 years being the invisible competence behind a visible fraud, which, and I say this with the authority of a man who spent 6 years doing exactly that for the man's mistress, is a very specific kind of slow poison. She came to Cinder on a rainy night after service, hood up, looking over her shoulder the whole way, and she asked to speak to me alone. Priya wanted to throw her out on principle. Bruno wanted to feed her on principle. Bruno won because Bruno always wins the feeding argument. And it turns out a person is much more likely to hand you the knife to end their boss when they're holding a bowl of good soup. I want to be clear, Mila said over the soup. I'm not a good person for doing this. I stayed for 2 years. I played over his mistakes. I helped him lie. Her hands were tight around the bowl. But I watched what they did to you on that stage. And I watched him laugh about it after, in the car, to Celine. About how the basement cook finally got what She stopped, started over. He called you the basement cook. And Celine laughed. And I realized I was going to spend the rest of my career plating over the mistakes of a man who calls people that. So, she reached into her bag and set a phone on the table. 2 years, recordings. Dorian admitting on tape, more times than I could count, that he can't cook the menu. Him and Celine planning the divorce show, the whole thing, before it happened. Him bragging about which of your dishes he'd take credit for next. And she hesitated, then pushed the phone the last inch toward me the night before your relaunch. Celine and Dorian and Celine's brother, Tobias, in a room, deciding to throw you out publicly instead of quietly. Specifically so that if you ever spoke up, no one would believe you. It's all there, in their own voices. Laughing, I looked at the phone. 2 years of a fraud's confessions handed to me across a bowl of Bruno's soup by a woman who'd finally decided she was worth more than the mistakes she'd been plating over. Why me, I asked. You could sell this. Rogue would have paid a fortune for it a week ago. Because you didn't scream, she said simply. On the stage, when she did that to you, everyone expected you to fall apart, and you just thanked her and left, like you already knew you'd win. I've spent 2 years around people who scream. She almost smiled. I wanted to see what quiet people do when you hand them the knife. I picked up the phone. Quiet people? I said, wait for the biggest possible room. There was one name in what Mila said that I filed away for later, because it was the loose thread I'd been half watching for weeks. Tobias, Celine's brother. The forgotten Marchetti. Tobias Marchetti was the family's other child, the one the documentaries never mentioned, because Livia had bet the whole dynasty on Celine and left Tobias to rot as a mid-level manager in his own family's company. Resentful and overlooked, and this is the part that mattered, convinced he deserved a bigger cut than a family who'd never respected him was ever going to give. Tobias had helped plan my humiliation, per Mila's tapes, which told me he was cruel. But cruel and loyal are different animals. And a man who's been overlooked his whole life by the people he's helping is a man with a price and a grudge, which is the most useful combination there is. I didn't approach Tobias. I let Tobias find out, through the industry grapevine, that Bruno and Mila now fed carefully, that the invisible creditor circling the family might be inclined to look kindly on an insider, someone who could confirm certain records, certain dates, certain conversations when the restructuring came. I didn't offer him anything explicitly. I just made sure Tobias understood that a ship was sinking, that his mother would put him and everyone else in the water before she'd give up her own seat, and that there was one lifeboat, invisible and patient, that might have room for a man who chose the right moment to stop drowning for a family that had never once thrown him a rope. Tobias took 2 weeks to break. Then he called a number Bruno had made sure reached him, and he started talking, and he confirmed everything on Mila's tapes and more. The debt maneuvers, the covered losses, the exact scale of how much trouble Livia was actually in. He thought he was buying himself a lifeboat. He was, in the sense that a rat that leaves a sinking ship early does technically survive, it just doesn't get to think of itself as a hero afterward. The family was hollow now. I want you to see it the way I saw it, from Cinder's tiny office, with a phone full of confessions, and a brother turned witness, and 2 lovers turned loose. Celine's web was down to 1 strand. Dorian, and Dorian was a fraud whose own assistant had just handed me his voice. Livia's money was fleeing. Her media man was a grudge. Her son was a witness. Her whole empire was a beautiful shell around a rot I'd been quietly hollowing for 6 years and had spent 1 month lighting. And the best part, the part that made me actually laugh out loud, alone in that office, was that none of it mattered unless they lost the one thing they still thought they could win, the championship. Because here is the trap, fully closed. The family could survive the smear collapsing. They could survive the investors getting nervous. They could survive Rogue's grudge and Thorne's cold feet and even Tobias's betrayal, if they had to. Because Livia was a survivor and empires can absorb a great deal of damage. What they could not survive was losing the championship, because the championship was the sovereign fund, and the sovereign fund was the only thing large enough to cover the debt that the invisible creditor, me, could call due at any moment. They had to win. Their entire existence now depended on winning a competition whose final verdict belonged to a single anonymous judge. And Celine finally figured out that last part. She figured it out the way you figure out the worst things, all at once, in a quiet moment, when the shape of the whole thing suddenly resolves. She was in a council briefing, sitting in for the family, listening to Nadia Kestrel outline the championship structure with that warm, terrible patience, and Nadia mentioned, as she did every year, that the final would be decided by the phantom palette, whose identity remained, as always, protected. And Celine, who had spent a month watching an invisible hand dismantle her family, with impossible, intimate precision, someone who knew the dates, the dishes, the exact misunderstanding in her recipe card, Celine made a connection she did not want to make. She went home and pulled up every clip of the season. The relaunch, the qualifier, the delivery invoice. And she noticed something she'd spent 6 years being too important to notice. That the man she'd thrown in an alley had always been the one who knew things he shouldn't. Which dish would win a critic? Which technique would break? Which rival kitchen would rise? She'd assumed it was talent. She was starting to suspect it was something worse. Authority. The kind of authority that judges finals. She didn't have proof. The phantom was anonymous, there was no proof to have. But she had a suspicion that turned her stomach. And she took it to Livia. And Livia did the most Livia thing imaginable. She decided to buy the phantom. If the family's survival depended on a verdict, and the verdict belonged to an unbuyable ghost, then Livia would simply make the ghost buyable, because in Livia's entire life, everything had eventually had a price. She went to the council. She requested, through channels and lawyers and enormous implied donations, an audience with the phantom palette, or failing that, a review of the judging process, or failing that, any crack, any lever, any human being she could reach who touched the verdict. She threw the full weight of $40 billion of empire at finding the one door she'd never been able to open. And she hit Nadia Kestrel. Nadia let her spend the whole approach, let Livia's lawyers and money and pressure build up against the council's walls for 2 full weeks. Let Livia believe she was making progress. Let her commit real resources and real hope to the idea that the ghost could be bought. And then Nadia granted Livia a single private meeting, in the office with no name on the building, and she let Livia make her entire pitch. All of it. The money and the veiled threats and the desperate reasonableness of a woman trying to save her life's work. And when Livia was done, Nadia Kestrel smiled the warm one, the son, that isn't safe one, and said, "Mrs. Marchetti, in 4 generations, my family has never once been able to buy the phantom palette. Do you understand what that means? It means the one incorruptible thing in this entire corrupt industry is the verdict you now need to survive." She let that land like a knife going in slowly. I could not sell it to you if I wanted to. And I want you to hear me very clearly when I tell you I do not want to. She stood, ending the meeting on her own schedule, the way she ends everything. Win it on the plate, Livia, if you can. I understand your daughter's husband is quite good in a kitchen. A pause, precise and cruel. I'd ask him for tips. Oh, but you threw him in an alley. How unfortunate for you. Livia left that office, having spent 2 weeks and a great deal of money, to learn that the one thing that could save her belonged to the one man she'd destroyed. Judged by the one woman who'd decided to enjoy watching her fall, she didn't know the phantom was Ren. Nadia hadn't told her. Nadia would never tell her. That reveal belonged to me, at the moment of my choosing, in the biggest possible room. But Livia walked out of there understanding finally fully that she was trapped. That every road out of her situation ran through a verdict she couldn't buy, a rival she couldn't outcook, and an invisible creditor she couldn't find. She was a woman who did math when she was afraid, and for the first time in her long, ruthless life, the math came back with no solution. Bruno brought me that story over broth, because Bruno now had a pipeline of information running through 3 defectors and a council chair who'd taken a shine to me. And he told it slow, savoring it the way he savored a good stock. She actually tried to buy the ghost, he said, gold tooth flashing, $40 billion, and she went shopping for you like you were a truffle. He shook his head. Boy, you built a trap so tight the woman walked into it trying to bribe her way out of it. I didn't build the trap, I said. They built it. I just moved into the empty half and waited. I looked out the tiny window of Cinder's office at a city where an empire that legally belonged to me was thrashing itself apart, trying to save a life it didn't know I held in my hand. All that's left now is the final. They have to win it. They can't win it because the person judging it is me, and the person cooking against them is the best chef I've ever stood next to, and I sharpened her myself. I finished the broth. So they'll do the only thing desperate people do when they can't win clean. Which is cheat, I said, spectacularly. In public, on the biggest stage there is, I set down the empty bowl, which is exactly what I need them to do. Because a family that gets thrown out of an alley is just a sad story. A family that cheats at the World Gastronomy Championship, on live television, in front of 9 million people and a sovereign wealth fund, and gets caught by the very ghost they tried to buy. That's an ending. And I was very, very ready to serve it. The night before the final, I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I let someone cook for me. Nadia's apartment, not the office, the actual apartment, which almost no one had ever seen, was smaller than you'd expect and warmer than she'd ever admit. And she stood at her own stove and made me a bowl of pasta with the ferocity of a woman who considered it a personal failing that I kept forgetting to eat. Tomorrow you burn it all down, she said, setting the bowl in front of me. Tonight you sit in my kitchen and you let the most dangerous person in your industry make sure you don't collapse from spite-based malnutrition. Eat. I ate. It was, and I say this as the phantom palate, genuinely good. Not restaurant perfect. Better than that. It tasted like it was made by someone who wanted me alive. You know they're going to cheat, she said, sitting across from me with her own bowl. I'm counting on it. I twirled pasta and did not look up, because looking up at Nadia Kestrel when she's made you dinner is a tactical error I was not prepared to make. Livia can't win clean. She knows Priya's better than Dorian. She knows the verdict's out of her reach. So she'll do the only thing left. She'll try to make sure Cinder fails and Aurelia shines, by any means that money and desperation can buy. I finally looked up. The question is only which way they cheat, and thanks to a brother who found his lifeboat and an assistant who found her spine, I already know. Because Tobias had talked and Mila had listened, and between them I had the whole plan 2 days before Livia executed it. It was, I'll grant, a 2-pronged thing, and both prongs were cruel, and both were exactly what I'd have predicted from a family this far into the water. Prong 1, sabotage Cinder. Specifically, our final dish depended on a single irreplaceable component, a rare, aged element that Priya and I had built the entire course around, sourced from one supplier, delivered fresh the morning of the final. Impossible to substitute at the last minute. Livia's people had arranged, through money and a bribed courier, to intercept and spoil that delivery. Not steal it, spoil it. Let it arrive looking fine and be, on the inside, ruined, so that Priya would build her masterpiece on a rotten foundation and only discover it plated on TV, in front of the world when it was far too late. A broken sauce, but on purpose and on us. Prong 2, Dorian couldn't cook. Everyone in that family knew it now. The broken sauce had cured them of the fantasy. So for the final, the most important service of the family's life, they'd hired a ringer. A genuinely excellent chef, brought in secretly, sequestered, who would create the final dish in advance and drill Dorian to reproduce the visible motions while the real work was done off-camera or prepped ahead. Dorian would present a masterpiece he hadn't made to a blind judge, and if the judge scored it high, which a good dish would earn, the family would win, the fund would invest, the debt would be covered, and the invisible creditor could go to hell. It was a good plan. It would have worked against almost anyone. It was not going to work against a judge who knew exactly what was coming, a chef he'd sharpened himself, and a supplier he'd quietly warned the night before. "So you swapped the delivery," Nadia said, reading it off my face, because she reads everything off my face. "It's deeply unfair." "I let them spoil a delivery," I said. "Just not ours. The morning courier they bribed will intercept exactly the shipment they think is ours, and spoil it beautifully, and feel very proud. It's a decoy. The real component came in last night, through a different supplier, and it's sitting in a walk-in they don't know exists, guarded by a 71-year-old man who has waited his whole life for a reason to guard something." I twirled the last of the pasta. "So tomorrow, Livia's saboteur ruins a box of very expensive nothing. Priya cooks with the real thing. And Aurelia's ringer-made masterpiece walks up to a blind judge who happens to be the one person alive who can tell in one bite that the man presenting it never touched it." I set down the fork. They built the whole final around fooling the Phantom. They just don't know the Phantom is the man they threw in an alley. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and very deliberately stole the last bite of pasta off my plate and ate it, holding my eyes the entire time, which I recognize in retrospect as the single most dangerous thing that happened to me during that entire war. "When it's done," she said, "when they're in the ashes and you've walked out clean, I'm going to want that dinner. The one in the ashes. You cook, I sit. No council, no ghost, no empire. Just a man who made me cross a room making me dinner because he wants to and not because it's a weapon." She stood, clearing the bowls with the same bored precision she used on a fish. "You can say no. I'll keep asking. It bores everyone into yes eventually. But I'd rather you didn't make me be boring about it." "Nadia," I said. Ask me after the final. When I'm not the Phantom or the owner or the wronged husband. When I'm just the man who ruined them." I met her eyes and for once didn't lose the staring contest. "Ask me then, and I won't make you be boring about it." She almost smiled. "The full one. The son that isn't safe." "Go home, Mr. Vale," she said softly. "Sleep. Tomorrow you have a family to bury and a room to walk out of. And the day after that," she paused at the sink, not turning around. "The day after that, you owe me dinner in the ashes." The World Gastronomy Championship final is the closest thing my industry has to a coronation and a public execution held in the same room. And this year it was both. Picture it, a purpose-built arena, 2 kitchen stations facing a raised judge's pass, a live audience of everyone who matters in food, and a broadcast pulling numbers that make network executives weep with joy. 2 finalists. Aurelia, the wounded giant, $40 billion of legacy, Dorian Pike at the center in a jacket with his name in gold, and behind him, in the family box, Livia and Celine and a nervous constellation of the investors who hadn't yet fled. And Cinder, the 12-seat impossibility. Priya Anand at the center where she'd earned her place. Bruno on support because he'd threatened violence if we made him watch from the crowd. And me at Priya's shoulder as consulting chef, in a plain jacket with no name on it at all, which everyone read as humility and which was actually the single funniest joke in the building. And above it all, on the raised pass, the judges' table. 4 named critics, respected, visible, and 1 empty chair, draped, set apart for the 5th and final judge, whose vote outweighed all the others combined, whose identity had never been known, who would arrive masked and cloaked and anonymous as the Phantom Palette always did, deliver the verdict that decided everything, and vanish. That chair was mine. I just wasn't sitting in it yet. The rules of the final were brutal and simple. Each finalist would cook 1 dish, 1 shot, 1 plate, the dish of their life, presented blind to the judges, no names, scored on the food alone with the Phantom's verdict as the deciding vote. Simple. Except that this year 1 finalist was cooking with a decoy in their walk-in and a ringer in their story, and the other was cooking with the truth and a ghost at her shoulder. The cooking began, and for a while it was just cooking, beautiful and violent and precise, the way the best of it is. Priya was transcendent. I'd watched her cook for a month, and I still wasn't ready for what she did under those lights. She took the dish we'd built together, the argument you lose gratefully dish, and she elevated it past anything we'd rehearsed. Because that's what real chefs do when the room is trying to break them. They get better. The rare aged component, the real one, the one Bruno had guarded all night like a dragon on a very small hoard, was flawless, and she treated it with the reverence it deserved. and I watched the four named judges lean forward at their pass without even meaning to. Across the arena, Dorian performed. And it was a performance, and to the untrained eye, it was a good one. The ringer had drilled him well. He moved through the motions of a masterpiece he didn't understand. And the dish that came together in front of him was genuinely excellent. Because the ringer was genuinely excellent, and for one bad moment I understood that Livia's plan was better than I'd credited. The food was good enough that a blind judge, judging food alone, might well score it at the top. If the judge were anyone but me, then came the sabotage, and this is the part I'd been waiting for. The part where a cheat becomes a self-execution. Livia's saboteur, a bribed floor runner, planted to move among the stations, made his approach on Cinder during the chaos of plating, timed to knock or spoil or contaminate at the last critical second. The kind of thing that reads as an accident on television. He came at Priya's station with a tray, angling to stumble into the component at the exact wrong moment. He never reached it, because Bruno, 71, dishwasher, official title, actual history, a starred chef in Turin, had spent the entire final not watching the cooking. He'd been watching the floor. He'd been watching for exactly this, because I'd told him it was coming, and Bruno had waited his whole ruined life for a reason, to stand between something precious and the people who'd try to break it. He stepped into the runner's path with a rack of clean plates. A slow old man who was suddenly and precisely exactly where he needed to be, and the runner's tray went into the plates instead of the dish. A crash, a mess, a moment. And the whole thing happened directly in front of a broadcast camera that had been pushing in for a beauty shot of Priya's plating. The runner froze. Bruno looked at him, this ruined old dishwasher with a gold tooth, and said, loud enough for the boom mic, "Careful, son, you almost ruined something you'd have to answer for." And the runner, young, bribed, in over his head, did the thing that guilty people do when they're caught on camera. He ran. He bolted from the floor of the World Gastronomy Championship final, on live television, in front of 9 million people, which is not a thing that innocent floor runners do. And every commentator in every booth said, at roughly the same time, some version of, "What was that?" Livia's first prong didn't just fail. It announced itself. It planted, on the record, in front of the world, the seed of a question. Was someone trying to sabotage the 12-seat kitchen? And who would have reason to? Celine, in the family box, went the specific color of a lemon that's been left in the sun too long. That waxy, overbright yellow of something that used to be fresh. Because she understood, before anyone else in that box, that the plan had just started eating itself. But the runner was just the appetizer. The dishes were finished. 2 plates, unlabeled, carried to the raised pass. Priya's, the truth, the aged component, the argument you lose gratefully. Dorian's, the ringer's masterpiece, presented by a man who couldn't have named half of what was on it. And the 4 named judges tasted and scored. And it was close, genuinely close, because the ringer really was that good. And the arena held its breath waiting for the 5th judge, the Phantom Palette. The lights dimmed the way they do every year for the Phantom's entrance. The theatrical hush, the anonymous cloaked figure who would arrive from the wings, taste both plates, and deliver the verdict from behind the mask, and vanish. The whole arena turned toward the wings. And I stepped away from Priya's shoulder, walked to the raised pass, and sat down in the empty chair. Not cloaked, not masked, just me, Ren Vale, in a plain jacket with no name on it. Sitting down in the seat of the most powerful and secret authority in the entire food world. In full light, in front of 9 million people and a family that had thrown me into an alley. The arena did not understand at first. There was confusion, a murmur, a ripple, because the consulting chef from Cinder had just sat down in the Phantom's chair, which made no sense, which was against every rule, which was surely a mistake. A producer moved toward me. A commentator sputtered. And Nadia Kestrel, chair of the World Gastronomy Council, rose from her seat at the head of the pass, held up one hand to freeze the entire room, and said into a microphone that carried to every corner of the earth, "The Phantom Palette has judged this championship for 5 years. Tonight, for the first time, the Phantom has chosen to be seen. The council recognizes him. Let him speak." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses on your ears. 9 million people leaning through their screens. I looked at the 2 plates in front of me. Then I looked out at the arena, and I found the family box. And I found Livia, who had gone very still, the stillness of a woman doing the final piece of math and hating the answer. And Celine and Dorian, standing at his station with a masterpiece he hadn't made. And I let the moment stretch exactly as long as it needed to. Because I'd waited 6 years and 1 month, and I was not going to rush the plating. "My name is Ren Vale," I said. "Some of you know me as the sweet, talentless little cook a woman set free on a stage a few months ago." A ripple. "Some of you know me as the consulting chef of the 12-seat kitchen you all came to watch fail." A stronger ripple. "And for 5 years, All of you have known me as the Phantom Palette. The ghost, the verdict that couldn't be found, couldn't be bought. I looked directly at Livia, though not, I understand, for lack of trying. Livia's stillness broke. It broke into something I'd never seen on her face in 12 years, which was fear without a plan behind it. Fear with no math left. Now, before I deliver a verdict, I said, there's a small matter of authorship because this is a competition of chefs, and a verdict on a dish is worthless if we don't know whose hands made it. I picked up Dorian's plate, the Ringer's masterpiece, and I turned it slightly in the light, admiring it honestly because it deserved honest admiration. This is a beautiful dish, truly. Whoever made it is a serious talent. I set it down and looked at Dorian, standing at his station in his gold-stitched jacket, and I asked him one question, the same kind of question that had broken his sauce months ago. A question about the single most important technical decision in the dish in front of him. A choice only the person whose hands made it could possibly explain. Dorian opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Because he didn't know. He couldn't know. He hadn't made it. And the Ringer wasn't there to whisper the answer. And 9 million people watched the face of the Marchetti genius do the thing a fraud's face does when the one question it can't survive lands. It just stopped, mid-expression. Like a photograph of a man who's already gone. Take your time, I said, not unkindly, which was crueler than cruelty. It's your dish, you should know. He didn't. Everyone watched him not know. And into that silence I did the thing I'd been saving. The thing I'd built the shoebox and the account and the whole patient war toward. I laid it out. Clean. Dated. Merciless. He can't answer, I said, because he didn't make it. A chef was hired in secret to create this dish and drill Mr. Pike to present it. I know this because I know everything that happens in a kitchen. It's the one thing I've always been good at, whatever my ex-wife told you. I let a beat pass. Just as I know that the man who bolted off this floor 20 minutes ago was paid to sabotage the other station, and just as I know, because I have it dated, witnessed, on record, that every legendary dish the Marchetti Group has served for 6 years was created by me, at night, on a cot, and presented by a family who couldn't spell my name on the envelope they threw me out with. The arena detonated. I let it. Some detonations you have to let run their course before you can be heard over them. But I want to tell you about the reveal that mattered more than the authorship, because the authorship was vindication. And vindication is sweet, but it wasn't the knife. The knife was still coming, because Livia, in the box, even now, even here, Livia was already recalculating. I could see her doing it. A ruined genius reputation, a caught cheat, a public humiliation, all survivable in Livia's mind. If the empire still stood, if the money still flowed, if $40 billion of legacy could absorb the scandal and rebuild. She was already reaching for the survival she'd reached for her whole life. The empire itself, the thing she owned, the ground under her feet. So I took the ground. There's one more thing, I said, and something in my voice changed and the arena quieted, because animals know when the real predator finally speaks. For 6 years, while I cooked in the dark, I did one other thing with the money you paid me to keep me quiet. I bought. I let it hang. Slice by slice, through a holding vehicle 3 countries away that your investors have spent the last month failing to crack. I bought the debt. I bought the equity. I bought the ground your empire is standing on. I found Livia's eyes, and I did not let them go. The Marchetti Group does not belong to the Marchetti family. It hasn't for some time. It belongs to me, the invisible creditor you've been terrified of, the one you couldn't find, couldn't buy, couldn't outmaneuver, is the man you threw in an alley. And that debt tranche you scrambled to cover last month? That was me knocking, just to see if you'd hear it. You could have heard a whisk drop in that arena. I own it, Livia, I said quietly, and quiet carried further than any shout in that silence. The restaurants, the name, the ground, all of it. You've been running my company for me badly for years, and now the whole world knows it. At the exact moment your survival depended on winning a championship you tried to steal, in front of a fund that is watching you get caught. And then, because there is a rhythm to these things, and the verdict was still owed, and I am, whatever else I am, a professional, I turned to the 2 plates, the truth and the fraud. And I delivered the verdict I'd have delivered even if none of the rest were true. Because the Phantom Palette has never once been wrong, and I wasn't about to start for the sake of drama. On the food alone, blind, judged as the Phantom Palette always judges, I said, the winner of this year's World Gastronomy Championship is the kitchen that made this plate. I set my hand beside Priya's dish, the aged component. The argument you lose gratefully, the truth built by a blackballed girl the Marchettis had tried to bury 6 years ago. Cinder. Chef Priya Anand, because it's better. Not because of anything I've said tonight, because when I tasted it blind before I sat down before any of this, it was simply undeniably the better dish. That's the only thing the Phantom has ever judged, and it's the only thing I judged tonight. Priya Anand, blackballed, broke, furious, brilliant Priya put her hand over her mouth and did not cry, because she'd sworn she wouldn't, and then cried anyway, because some victories earn the tears, and Bruno crossed the floor and wrapped her in his tree-root arms. And the 12-seat kitchen that the whole internet had come to watch fail stood in the center of the World Gastronomy Championship, holding the only trophy that had ever mattered to any of us. And across the arena, in the family box, an empire came apart in real time. Because the sovereign fund, the money that was supposed to save the Marchettis, that only ever flowed to the winner, was watching all of it. Watching Dorian fail to name his own dish. Watching the saboteur bolt. Watching the family that needed this win get caught cheating to steal it. Exposed as frauds by the very ghost they'd tried to buy, on the very stage where their survival was decided. The fund's representatives, seated discreetly in the crowd, did not need a meeting to make their decision. You could see it happen from the pass, the quiet closing of a folio, the standing up, the leaving. The money didn't flee. The money simply, decisively walked, the way money does when the story it was buying turns out to be a fraud caught on live television. And I sat in the Phantom's chair, in a plain jacket with no name on it, and I watched the family that threw me in an alley lose the food, lose the trophy, lose the money, lose the story, and as the ownership of every restaurant they thought was theirs resolved, in the mind of every person watching, into a single name that was mine, lose the ground itself. Livia Marchetti, who does math when she's afraid, sat in her box with nothing left to calculate. Celine Marchetti, who set me free on a stage, watched the man she'd freed sit in judgment over everything she'd stolen and finally understood. 6 years too late on the biggest stage there is, in front of the whole watching world. Exactly what she'd thrown away. And Dorian Pike stood at his station beside a masterpiece he hadn't made, in a jacket with his name in gold, and had absolutely nothing to say, which was, at long last, the truest thing about him. I'd told Bruno it would be slow and public and that they'd help me do it without knowing. It had taken 6 years to build and 1 night to serve, and it wasn't even finished, because a reveal is not a downfall. A reveal is just the moment the audience learns the truth. The downfall, the groveling, the ruin, the part where they finally understand what they threw away and have to live in the understanding. That comes after, in the cascade, when the people who prop them up turn and run and there's no one left to lie to. That part I was going to watch, every second of it. But first, I had a chef to celebrate, a trophy to hand to the right hands, and a room to walk out of. I stood up from the Phantom's chair. I never sat in it again. Here is a thing nobody tells you about burning an empire to the ground. The fire is fast, but the collapse is slow, and the slow part is where the real satisfaction lives. The reveal takes a night. The ruin takes weeks. And I watched every day of it the way Bruno watches a stock reduce, patiently, without stirring too much, letting it become exactly what it was always going to be. It started before I'd even left the arena. The 3 of them, the 3 arrangements Celine had spun her fake life out of, ended up, through the pure comedy of circumstance, in the same backstage corridor within 20 minutes of the verdict, and none of them had known about the others. That was the part Celine had been proudest of. Over the years, keeping the 3 men in 3 separate boxes, each believing he was the exception. Caspian Rogue, the media man, already gutted, already a grudge, come backstage to watch the family that had spent him finally get spent themselves. Marcus Thorne, the money man, come to physically confirm that his investment was now legally owned by a stranger he'd spent a month failing to identify. And Dorian Pike, the front man, the one she'd actually wanted, wandering off the floor in his gold-stitched jacket with the hollow expression of a man who'd just discovered on live television that he couldn't name his own food. They collided in that corridor, and in the chaos, the shouting, the accusations, the recriminations flying in every direction, the boxes broke. Rogue, furious and loose-tongued, said something about everything I did for her. Thorne, nervous and precise, said something about the arrangement. Dorian, stupid and gutted, said the wrong name at the wrong volume. And the 3 of them stood in that corridor and did the math, each of them in real time, and arrived at the same answer, that they had never been the exception, that there had been 3 of them, that the woman they'd each thought they were quietly winning had been playing all 3, plus a genius on a cot the entire time. Mila got it on tape, because of course she did. She'd learned from watching me that quiet people wait for the biggest possible room, and she'd been waiting her whole career for this exact corridor. She didn't leak it. She didn't have to. 3 powerful, humiliated men who've just learned they were interchangeable to the same woman do not require a leak. They require only proximity to a phone, and there were 9 million of those pointed at the general vicinity of the Marchetti collapse. By morning, the corridor was its own scandal, separate from the championship, separate from the ownership. A pure human story that the internet devoured with the specific glee it reserves for the powerful discovering they were disposable. Rogue walked. Thorne walked. Dorian had nowhere to walk to, which we'll get to. And Celine Marchetti, who had built a fortress out of 3 men and a lie. Watched all 3 men leave through the same door in the same hour, each of them furious, none of them looking back. One strand of her web at a time, I'd told Priya weeks ago, is how you take a spider apart. But I'll be honest, at the end, they came apart all at once, and it was better than I'd planned, because I hadn't planned it. They did it to themselves. I'd only made sure they were all in the same corridor when the truth arrived. The 2 men who'd walked out of that corridor didn't get to walk quietly into the rest of their lives either, because I'd learned something from 6 years of watching Livia. You don't just remove people, you make sure the removal teaches the industry a lesson. So I let the market do to them what they'd tried to do to me. Caspian Rogue's whole empire had been built on one thing: the belief that his machine was honest, that when a rogue outlet called you a genius or a fraud, it meant something. He'd spent that belief on Livia's smear, and the delivery invoice had caught him, and now the finals revelations finished the job. Because it turned out that a media mogul who'd run a bought lie against the man who now owned $40 billion of the industry was a media mogul his advertisers no longer wanted to be seen near. They fled quietly, the way advertisers do, one logo at a time. His awards ballots, once the most coveted in food, became a punchline. Nobody wants a prize from a machine that's been proven for sale. Within a season, the man who'd decided who was a genius couldn't get his own calls returned, and the empire of influence he'd spent 30 years building came apart the way influence always does once people stop being afraid of you. All at once, and then completely. I didn't lift a finger, I just made sure, through a word here and there, that everyone remembered exactly what he'd done and for whom. The industry took it from there. Marcus Thorne got the investor's version, which is quieter, and to a man like Thorne, worse. He'd built his whole career on being the smart money, the one who saw the play before the room did. And the entire industry had now watched him pour anchor money into an empire that turned out to be a fraud propped up by a fake genius, missing for a full month that the real owner was an invisible man he couldn't identify, and then losing his nerve at exactly the moment that made him look both disloyal and slow. Smart money that gets seen being dumb money stops being able to raise the next fund. Doors that had always opened for Thorne developed a sudden stiffness. He wasn't ruined the way Rogue was ruined. He still had money. He just stopped being the man other money trusted, which for Thorne was the only wealth that had ever mattered. He'd wanted proximity to power. He got it. It just turned out the power was me, and I had a long memory and no reason to be generous. And here's the part I enjoyed most. Quietly, weeks later, the same food press that had spent a Tuesday calling me a thief, that had flooded the internet with Rogue's bought smear, now had to reckon with the fact that they'd been played, that they'd handed their credibility to a lie and gotten caught by a delivery invoice and a live broadcast. The verdict on the whole affair, when the industry finally rendered it, wasn't kind to anyone who'd carried water for the Marchettis. Careers built on that access quietly ended. The retrospectives got written by the few writers who'd stayed honest, including that young critic, the one who'd asked Dorian the question that broke the first sauce, who was now, deservedly, the most trusted voice in food because she'd been the one person the whole time who kept asking the obvious question nobody with a paycheck wanted answered. I made sure she never wanted for a story again. Loyalty like that, in an industry like this, is rarer than a 3rd star, and I've always paid for the rare ingredient. The family turned on itself next, and that was the part I'd deliberately set up. Because a family that eats its own is a family that saves you the trouble. Tobias went first, and Tobias went smart in the rat-like way of a man who'd spent his whole life being overlooked and had finally found the one moment where being overlooked was an advantage. While his mother and sister were drowning in the corridor scandal, Tobias quietly, publicly, tearfully, came forward, positioned himself as the one honest Marchetti, the son who'd always been uncomfortable with the family's treatment of Ren, who'd cooperated fully with the truth. It was a nauseating performance. It was also tactically correct. He separated himself from the sinking name early enough to keep a lifeboat exactly as I'd let him believe he could. He didn't get to be a hero, but he got to not drown, which for a man like Tobias was the only victory he'd ever really been playing for. I let him have it. A rat that leaves early is a rat that stops being my problem, and his testimony had already done its work. I'll tell you where Tobias landed, because it's the most fitting thing that happened to anyone in this whole affair. He kept his lifeboat, a mid-level job at one of the restaurants. Kept on because I keep everyone who cooks or serves, and Tobias, to his credit, could at least run a floor. But that's all he got. Not a name over a door, not a stake, not the vindication he'd spent his whole overlooked life imagining. He got to keep being exactly what his family had always made him. The Marchetti nobody remembers, now working in a building that used to bear his name and no longer did, under an owner who'd once slept on a cot in that same company's commissary. He'd spent 30 years resenting that he wasn't the important child. And in the end, the universe granted his wish with the precision of a genie who hates you. He became important to no one, permanently and safe. Some people you don't have to ruin. You just have to let them win the small thing they were always secretly playing for, and watch them realize too late how small it was. Livia did not get a lifeboat because Livia had never built one. She'd spent her whole life being the ship. And when the ship went down, she went with it, still doing math on the way under. She tried everything. She tried to challenge the ownership, but I'd built the vehicle to survive exactly that challenge. 6 years of clean, patient, unimpeachable acquisition, and her lawyers came back with the answer her own investors had already found. It was airtight. She tried to spin the cheating scandal, but you cannot spin a saboteur bolting on live television and a genius who can't name his own dish. Not when the whole world has already decided, correctly, what it watched. She tried to rally the family name, but the family name now belonged to me, literally on the paperwork. And the restaurants that bore it were mine to rename, which I did, one by one, over the following weeks. Watching the Marchetti letters come down off the buildings she'd spent a lifetime putting them up on. Aurelia I kept open. I gave it to Priya. She rebuilt the menu, the real menu, our menu, cooked by hands that understood it. And the third star came back within the year, this time with the right name on the card. And I want to stay on Priya for a moment, because if this were only a story about the people who lost, it would be a smaller story than the one I lived. Priya Anand had been blackballed at 26 by a family who couldn't stand that she was better than their daughter. And she'd spent 6 years running a 12-seat room on a wheezing walk-in and pure spite. Cooking food nobody with power would come taste because Livia had quietly made sure of it. When I handed her Aurelia, not lent, not partnered, handed, the deed in her name, because I'd learned what it does to a person to cook genius in someone else's spotlight, and I was not going to do to her what Celine did to me. She stood in the middle of that gleaming dining room for a long time and didn't say anything at all. Then she said, "You're sure?" Not a question so much as a door she was afraid to walk through. "It's yours," I said. "All of it. I own the company. You own this house. Those are different things, and I'm keeping them different on purpose. Because the whole point of what we just did is that the person who cooks the food gets the name on the card. I'm not going to be one more man who owns your kitchen." I handed her the keys. "Cook like it's yours, because it is. And when they come to review it, and they will, all of them, the ones who were too scared of Livia to come to Cinder, you don't cook for them. You make them cook up to you. You've earned that. You earned it 6 years ago, and nobody let you have it. Have it now." The reviews, when they came, were the kind chef's frame. The industry that had blackballed her fell over itself to rediscover her, which is the industry's favorite move. It loves nothing more than a genius it can pretend it didn't spend 6 years ignoring. Priya let them. She was gracious in public and merciless in the kitchen, which is exactly the right ratio. And within a year, Aurelia under her name was better than it had ever been under mine in the dark. Because a dish cooked in the light by someone who's allowed to own it is always better than the same dish cooked in secret by someone who isn't. And Bruno. I have to tell you about Bruno, because a 71-year-old dishwasher who guarded a walk-in all night and stepped into a saboteur's path with a rack of clean plates does not go back to the dish pit, not on my watch, not ever again. I gave him the one thing he'd lost in a fire in Turin 40 years ago and never dared want again. A kitchen. Small. He insisted on small 12 seats because he'd fallen for Cinder's bones and refused to let the space become a nobody's storage unit once we'd moved up in the world. His name over the door. His stock, which is still, to this day, the single best thing I have ever put in my mouth, and I say that as the phantom palate retired. He cried when I told him. He'd deny it. He denies it still, loudly, whenever I bring it up, usually while pushing a bowl of broth at me and telling me I don't eat enough. But he cried. This ruined old man who'd spent 40 years at the bottom of other people's sinks, and he grabbed the back of my neck with one tree root hand and pulled my forehead to his and said, in that language of grunts and half-sentences we'd built on smoke breaks over 6 years, "You didn't have to." "I know," I said. "That's the whole point of doing it. Because here's the thing, the people who threw me in an alley never understood, the thing that was the actual difference between us the entire time. They thought power was what you took. Bruno taught me it's what you give to the people who were good to you before you had any. Livia took for 30 years and died irrelevant. I gave a kitchen to an old man and a name back to a blackballed genius. And I'd trade the whole $40 billion empire for either of those 2 moments before I'd trade it for anything Celine ever pretended to offer me. There was one scene I'd promised myself back on that first night in the alley, and I want to tell you about it because it was the only piece of the whole ruin I engineered purely for me. I'd told Bruno I wasn't going to fight them for the empire, that it was already mine, and I'd just let them keep polishing it until the day I walked in and turned on the lights. So a few weeks after the final, once the ownership had fully, unimpeachably resolved, I did exactly that. I walked into the Marchetti Group headquarters, my headquarters, on the paperwork, on the morning of the board meeting where Livia was making her last stand. Her final desperate pitch to a room of directors about how the family would rebuild, weather the scandal, survive. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't need one. You don't need an appointment to enter a building you own. The receptionist, who had watched me be thrown into an alley on live television, looked at me with the particular terror of someone who has just realized the entire hierarchy of her world has been quietly inverted, and she is standing at the front desk of it. I told her not to announce me. I like doing my own announcing. The boardroom had glass walls, because Livia loved to be seen presiding, and through them I could watch her working the room. The nerve, the certainty. The woman who'd built $40 billion out of exactly this ability to make frightened people believe her. She was mid-sentence, mid-rally, telling 12 terrified directors that the invisible creditor could be negotiated with, that no one simply seizes an empire this size, that the family had weathered worse. I opened the door. The sentence died in her throat the way the last one had on the stage, months ago. Except this time there was no stage, no cameras, no 9 million people to perform for. Just a boardroom. And 12 directors, and a mother who did math when she was afraid, watching the man she'd thrown away walk into the room she thought was hers and pull out the chair at the head of the table. Her chair, the one she'd presided from for 30 years. "Don't get up," I said, though she hadn't. "This won't take long. You can't." She started and stopped because we both knew I could, and the not being able to finish the sentence